Imagine knowing exactly what your students are learning and exactly which steps you need to take next.
Join us in Down with the Reading Quiz to craft meaningful and productive formative assessments that move away from gotcha moments of basic recall and toward assessing what your students actually can do.
In this 30-minute free masterclass, we'll share 3 powerful assessment keys that work for any novel at any time of the year.
Head to shop.bravenewteaching.com/masterclass to sign up, and we'll also send you a free workbook to keep track of all your notes.
Once again, that's shop.bravenewteaching.com/masterclass to nail formative assessments forever.
Well, hello and welcome back to Brave New Teaching. And welcome today, friends, to another rerun of the podcast. We've been doing quite a few of these lately because we are in our 3rd year of the Brave New Teaching podcast. And we have got some content that some of our newer listeners we think could really benefit from. And even some of you who have been with us since the beginning, like, I wonder if you remember some of these episodes. We are kicking off today a little series on poetry. Teaching poetry, teaching poetic analysis. And yes, so to kick off this little series, we wanted to do a rerun. And as I was looking back to do the intro today for a rerun from our very first season of the podcast, this is an episode that we actually broke up into 2 parts. So we are going way back to season 1, episodes 5 and 6, which we entitled To Teach Poetry Part A and To Teach Poetry Part B. These episodes are about 20 and 25 minutes each, so we're just going to cram them together today into one big rerun episode. I will say that you're probably going to want to have some note-taking materials, if you will, nearby. So if you're listening to this in the car or on a walk, or like me, I always listen when I'm like doing the dishes or kneading bread, just kind of keep like a notes app, maybe memo app nearby so that you can record some things, or just like hop back in. Make sure that you check out the show notes so you can see any of the links that we talk about in the episode. Yeah, I mean, you'll hear, we sound a little bit different because we're not quite used to the idea of podcasting yet. And Amanda and I are still getting our rhythm. So if we sound a little funny, not funny in like our regular, like quirky, funny way, but more funny in like the, why do you guys sound so awkward way? No, yeah, now you get it. That's why. So yeah, we talk about just our approaches to teaching poetry, where we think some of our own biggest pitfalls are either early in our career or like now. Teaching poetry is one of Amanda's big passions, and it's definitely something that she is extremely strong at. I think you all know that like Shakespeare is that's the thing for me. And so, yes, that's poetry, but Amanda is much more comfortable with poetry in a much broader sense. And so you can hear even from just like 3 years ago, the differences in our approaches and how much expertise Amanda has in this area. And so I'm excited for those of you who have already heard it to hear it again, renewed a little bit, because a lot has happened in the world and in the world of education since the year 2020. And then, yeah, this came out April 15th of 2020 was episode 5, To Teach Poetry Part A. So buckle up, because, it's so much has changed and so much has stayed the same, even in the past 3 years. I also want to take a moment right now to make sure that you all get to hear the news that we have a poetry and creative writing workshop coming at you very, very soon. We were going to do this earlier this spring. At the time of recording, this is 2023, spring of 2023. We were going to bring this festival or workshop to you earlier this spring. And then we realized, you know what? The world is a little too crazy in the world of Brave New Teaching and of Amanda and Marie. Our lives have a lot going on right now. So we decided to postpone this, and it is coming out, in fact, later this month in April. So if you're listening to this in real time, make sure you head to the show notes or to curriculumrehab.com/poetry workshop to get some more information and get yourself registered. It is a workshop all about reading, analyzing, and then creating your own poetry and creative writing with students. We're going to be running this workshop a little bit differently than we have in the past, whereas like our Shakespeare workshops, our dystopia workshop had more of like a day by day approach of first, we're going to talk about introducing some type of a unit. Then we're going to talk about like different activities. Then we're going to do unit walkthroughs. Then we're going to do assessment, right? It had like a progression through what your curriculum might actually look like. But then we're instead going to be this time kind of more philosophically approaching things. So we're going to be looking at like the analytical approach to poetry and creative writing. Then we're going to be looking at student imitation and then actual student products and projects and that sort of a thing when it comes to poetry and creative writing. We've got some special guests this time, some interviews that are professionals and experts in their field of poetry, creative writing, and the creative arts and stuff like that. So we are very excited to bring that to you. So make sure you check out the show notes. And with no further ado, enjoy this 2-part rerun that we are cramming into one. And we will catch you next week with a brand new episode of Brave New Teaching. See you later.
You're listening to Brave New Teaching, and we are so much more than a podcast.
We give teachers the inspiration, support, and tools to challenge the status quo.
I'm Amanda, and I'm a former English teacher from Illinois.
And I'm Marie, and I'm a teacher from Southern California.
Join us at bravenewteaching.com to find out more about our courses, festivals, and get every episode's show notes.
We're so glad you're here. Enjoy the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Brave New Teaching, a podcast by 2 English teachers challenging the status quo. I am so excited to have you all here.
Marie, we're going to tackle it. It is officially National Poetry Month, which is not the only month you should be teaching poetry, by the way.
But it's a great foot in the door for this episode. And speaking of nerdy things, you guys are going to hear Amanda nerd out real hard about teaching poetry because she's phenomenal at it.
If you guys listened to our earlier episodes, I talked a little bit about my journey in undergrad, and a lot of that was wrapped up in creative writing and poetry. So this is kind of like my undergrad baby, almost like drama and theater were in part of your undergrad baby. So this was one of my specialties was creative writing. My other was actually Spanish, which is a whole nother episode. But this is something very near and dear to my heart is poetry, and even like the research around instructing poetry was something that I carried with me into my master's degree. And so I've got a lot to share. And the first piece of very official research I'd like to begin with is I did a very unofficial survey on Instagram not too long ago. And I asked teachers, why do you struggle with teaching poetry? I want to be clear. I assume people are struggling, which is why I phrased it that way. And you guys would be surprised. I asked a lot about, I kind of gave multiple choice answers, and I said, was it time, resources? And then the option that actually won by a landslide was teaching poetry intimidates me, and I'm super insecure about my ability to do it. Are you surprised?
No, I'm not surprised because my answer was in between I lose time and the one you were just saying, the imposter syndrome one. Like, I feel like if I don't teach poetry to like do each poet and each poem justice, that I'm somehow cheating my students and therefore I'm a fraud and I should not have my job anymore. I mean, it's a little extreme, but that's kind of like where I go.
Slippery slope.
It is. It's a rough one, man.
Well, and that kind of lands us in the crisis we have right now, which is that a lot of teachers are just not doing it. We're just going to kind of like, no one's really requiring it. Common Core, and even I know in Illinois, we have some state standards apparently. But as I've looked through those, I've looked through Common Core, there is nothing concrete anywhere other than a little bit in NCTE that's really pushing English teachers to actually make sure that it's part of the curriculum. It's very much a suggestion at this point, and that's problematic for not only us but our students, because poetry, guys, I want this episode to really be a how to build your poetry teacher confidence episode, because it's not as scary as we might envision the experience. And I think we can maybe break that down for you guys and make it a little bit more accessible.
No, absolutely. And I mean, selfishly, this is kind of like a like a one-on-one workshop for me that all of our listeners are getting to tune into. I don't find myself like, I wouldn't say that I'm bad at teaching poetry. Like I think because like Shakespeare is one of my real strong suits. So like I can teach poetry and the meaning behind words. I just don't think about it. Like I forget sometimes about poetry, which I mean, okay, smite me where I stand. Like I get it. But also I feel so pressed to get to like nonfiction texts because it's something that, at least because I'm in California, the UCs and the CSUs are like, teach nonfiction. Students need to be able to go to college and be able to read an article and get it. And I'm like, okay, cool. But then like I forget also to add poetry into my units. And then it's an afterthought. I also don't have a very not wide experience, but I don't have a very expansive poetry catalog in my brain. And most of my poems go back to poems that are overdone, that they've already learned in middle school, and that are sonnets by William Shakespeare. So that's where this moment from somebody like you, Amanda, you've got such a passion for poetry and you've got such a relatable way to make it real and tangible, not just for students, but for teachers. Because I mean, we're the reason that I am the reason that my students have not been learning about poetry this year. Sorry, guys. I know you're all listening. All the teenagers in San Diego are listening. Sorry, I didn't teach you better poetry. You can leave that on my Yelp review.
Well, this is okay. So if we're going to go 1 through 5, number 1 is to embrace your own vulnerability alongside the kids. So
check.
Marie, you could not have set that up more perfectly, because you guys, it's totally awesome that for once we feel about just as nervous as the kids do in tackling something new. For our whole school year goes by where we're the clear experts in the room and the kids are the ones who are new to everything. So poetry really offers us this amazing opportunity to be not at the same level, because we're educated, in our discipline, but we're allowed to be equally vulnerable. I think the vulnerability of teaching poetry is just about as extreme as the vulnerability of suggesting a thought about a poem that you just read for the first time. I mean, those are terrifying experiences. And I think they become more terrifying, like you said, Marie, the more infrequent that the experience is.
Well, and part of the thing that I start to shy away from also, even when I get really comfortable with a certain poem, is that, okay, now I'm just feeding kids what this means. Like I have to step back and make sure that I'm allowing space for that vulnerability piece. Like I'm allowing space for new thought to happen.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I cannot wait to hear the rest of these. Okay, you guys, there are 5 tips she's giving us right now. I happen to be looking at the shared document and there's some really good stuff coming. So I'm going to stop interrupting you.
No, but you're right. I mean, by not being the one feeding or the expert, you're creating a bond. Yep. And some of the poems I've done in my class before, those are the things that we remember at the end of the year. So if you guys listened to last week's episode about visualizing a unit, I kind of went on a little mini rant about making sure that your units weren't only about the novel. Here's a perfect example of where that comes into play. When we get to the end of the school year, my kids really aren't like, oh my God, I'll never forget that scene from A Raisin in the Sun when blah, blah, blah. But they do remember when we looked at Dream Deferred. They were like, it was so gross that the pussy raisin was blah, blah, blah. They totally remember that. I know. Sorry. That was pretty gross.
I made the grossest face that you guys can't see, but Amanda can see because we're on Skype. I was like, whoa.
Poetry is bonding by nature, especially when you're attacking it together at the same level. So that's really one, is just embrace that and talk to the kids about it and say, listen, this is new for me too. Let's tackle it together and let's see what we find out. So let's move on to number 2. So these are connected. Number 2, I would say, is to teach poems that you're in love with and that are in your comfort zone. Guys, if you're new to teaching poetry, I would not tackle something super abstract from Emily Dickinson. Dickinson, she's a nut job and I love her, but I've dedicated more random amounts of time to researching her life and her work than is humanly acceptable. You don't need to go teach Dickinson. Go find a poet or a poem and teach a couple that are things that speak to you. Obscure 18th century poetry is not on, like I said, there's no standards. really.
True.
So
really
so
the only one, and like the one that I have started to pull in to go be like, okay, this is my excuse for forcing myself to teach poetry, is the one, I want to say it's Reading Literature 4, you're welcome, about word meaning and like connotative and denotative. Is that the one?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Okay. Because there is a standard about deriving meaning from words and their usage.
Yes,
that's
there's a language standard.
Pretty much the only one. Was it language? I think you're right.
Yeah, totally. I can in another episode talk to you about how we can totally teach characterization and theme and all kinds of other standards using poetry too. But that's another day. I would say if you guys are using a novel unit of some sort and you're using an essential question, finding poems that are within the theme of that unit is really easy and tactile, easy for you to find. I love finding my poets. Poets.org has a really nicely organized search engine. You can search by genre, theme. You can search by poet, by year. So poets.org is beautiful. You can search for poems on YouTube. Guys, there's so much on the YouTube.
I do love the YouTube for a lot of reasons.
There's so much poetry. There's so much brilliant spoken word out there. And there's a lot of newer voices reading older poetry there too. And that's a really cool thing because you can always pull up the same poem by 2 different videos and see how it's treated 2 different ways. I mean, YouTube's really an amazing source. I also love the hashtag on Twitter, even on Instagram of Teach Living Poets. There's a lot of really cool recommendations that come out of that hashtag. So keep your social media eyes alive to find great new poems that are going to be easy for you.
I think another good place to look, and this is where like the internet is such a like savior for people like me who are like, I don't have very much experience with poetry, and then I get all intimidated and I like shy away from it, like I was saying before. But like more and more like hashtags like Teach Living Poets, or even just like finding those key teachers or artists or what have you that you want to follow on social media. They will show you what they're reading, and what they're reading is probably going to be something you're interested in. And if it's something you're interested in, it's going to be less intimidating to teach and to tackle and to like dive into with kids and just explore.
Absolutely. And so I'd say, just to kind of wrap up number 2, one of my favorites to teach is Oranges by Gary Soto. Have you ever read it?
I did. I do like that poem. Yes.
I love
that
Oranges.
Poem.
Well, Oranges is a great example because you guys, if you don't even want to teach the poetic components of Oranges, you can teach the narrative ones.
Yeah, just the story.
Yes, there are so many poems out there that just have story elements. You can look at the developments of your characters, the conflict, things that those skills are in your comfort zone. So choose a poem that's in your comfort zone, no matter whether that's the topic, the skills, the century, or the theme, whatever you choose, just go in your comfort zone first.
Yeah, like use that as your gateway poem, like a gateway
Totally. Totally. Gateway drugs are good. Okay. Let's go to number 3 for poetry. Let's go to number 3, which kind of steps us up a little bit more into the analysis side of things. So number 3 is advice I would actually give you for writing and reading as well. But my advice is for number 3, teach it often and teach it the same way. So I think one of the things that we struggle with poems is like, oh my gosh, every time I do a poem, it's a whole new experience. It's a whole new poem. How am I going to approach it? I don't know what to do. Well, if you do it the same way every time, it's a little bit more comfortable for both you and your students because you're looking for the same things. So when I was in high school, I remember using TPCast. I remember actually hating TPCast. I don't remember exactly why, but I remember thinking, this is terrible. Poems are supposed to be whatever I want them to mean. And I was really, I really believed in that.
Hey, so I'm trying to like, I can't remember. I remember looking for very vague, like, what figurative language do you see here? And I was like, all of it. I don't know. It's really figurative.
But okay, so herein lies the problem with teaching poetry. It's like, what do I do?
Right.
So I went to grad school, like I told you guys, I did that thing. And one of my focal points was, okay, I want to make a framework for teaching poetry that doesn't kill poetry, first of all, because poetry is not meant to exist only in English classrooms where it goes to die. And I wanted something that was going to be teacher and student friendly. So I created this thing. It's called the Big Six. It's not really revolutionary, but I think the philosophy behind it is important. And so what I tell kids is like, okay, we're going to learn how to use the Big Six. And I have these 6 elements in a circle, and I'll link it for you guys all in the show notes for sure. It's a freebie. I have it for you guys. And the way that I tell kids about the Big Six is I say, listen, we're going to use these as ways to enter a conversation about a poem. Because a lot of times what happens is we look at a poem and we think, okay, what do we do now? How do we start this?
Where do I even start? Yeah. Like, I read it.
Exactly.
I know that there are words in a language that I understand, and that's my full stop. Right. I mean, I'm speaking both as a kid and sometimes as like myself, like an experienced English language arts teacher. So I like that what you have is tools that can be used in different ways. Like what you're saying, teach it often and teach it the same way. Like use these tools on all these different texts so that you get really comfortable with, like, you're not going to use a hammer on the exact same nail every single time. Like use it on different nails.
On different nails. The metaphors, guys, they
are really rich.
Those are extra. Those are free, actually.
Yeah.
Free extra.
You don't even have to pay for
this
that.
episode. Nope, you do not. So the Big Six is, when you introduce it to kids, I really want them to understand, like, this is not how you analyze a poem. This is how you start a conversation about poetry. And so my 6 items are: 1 is the title, 2 is the speaker, 3 is paraphrasing, because a lot can come from a paraphrase. 4, we look at the themes or big picture things that are being addressed. 5, we look at the figurative language, the tool. I just call it tools.
Okay. Oh, like a writer's tools. Okay.
Exactly. And just like if you look at 1 or 20, whatever. And then the last item on my list, the 6th, is called the turn. And that's like the more sophisticated one, I think, of the 6. And the turn is basically, where does the poem shift or make a drastic change? And that's a fun one to teach because it's usually where something is happening in the poem. And the kids usually have fun trying to find it, like a little scavenger hunt.
Okay.
And that's a good one. So we can talk more about that later, but these are 6 ways that you can start talking. And so the lesson becomes very simple now, because once you've trained your kids on what these Big 6 are, you present them a poem, and I say, you're always going to read it twice first. So usually they'll either hear the poet read it on YouTube, and then they'll read it out loud, popcorn, or they'll read it in pairs, and then they'll hear me read it out loud, or they're going to hear it twice. Then I say, okay, so maybe for lesson 1, I'll say, I want you guys to work in pairs, and I want you guys to choose 2 elements of the Big 6 to start your conversation. And then they talk in their pairs, la, 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 think, pair, share. And then we talk to the whole class. Hey, you guys, what did you talk about? Oh, cool. And then I annotate, like little notes, what they say. And another pair shares out. And then another pair shares out. And all of a sudden, my beautiful clean sheet of paper poem is this gorgeously annotated, which was the goal in the first place.
Right.
Of work. Right. So they've kind of done it in a deceivingly casual way.
Well, they've crowdsourced their annotations.
Ding, ding, ding.
And they're practicing all of these different skills. So like you do this 2, maybe 3 times as a big class, or once as a big class, once as a group of 4, once as a pair. And then it's like, okay, and here's your poem, 3 days later to go home, and you're going to do this yourself.
Well, hopefully they're just learning to do it in a way that it's not this like threateningly intimidating experience. Well, I hope you guys learned so much today. I just love talking about poetry with my teacher friends, and I'm so glad you could join us on the podcast today. Remember, being a brave new teacher is all about trying new things and being brave to do so, and that's what we're here to help you do. So don't forget to stay tuned. Next week, we'll be coming at you with the second half and our 2 other strategies that you can bring into your classroom right away and implement. And if you want to hear even more about poetry, I've got tons over on my website. You can find me at www.mudandinkteaching.org. I'd also love to show you a preview or even get you a copy of my brand new ebook. I just finished it and published it, guys, and it is hot off the presses, and I really am encouraging teachers to think about using it as they start planning their instruction for the upcoming school year, and maybe just taking it with you over summer break to think about, okay, where does poetry belong in my curriculum? This is what I'm here to help you do, and it's what I've been doing for a really, really long time. My ebook, guys, you can find it on my TPT store. You can also find it in the links here on the show notes and on our blog if you want to take a look. I'd be happy to coach you through any questions that you have. Feel free to shoot me an email, and we'll talk to you guys soon. See you next week.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Brave New Teaching. So this episode that you just started is a continuation of last week's episode. And so we just wanted to say really quickly before we get going, if you missed last week's episode, the first half of teaching poetry, you're going to want to listen to that one first. So hop over there first and then come back to this one. But if you're ready to rock and roll, we are not going to make you wait any longer. I do have one more announcement, though. If you already know that you're like, I need more of this. I need more of this poetry in my life. I need the way that they are talking about it to happen for me. You're really going to want to head over to mudandinkteaching.org to get your hands on Amanda's poetry ebook, Poetry Instruction in the Secondary Classroom. All of her poetry genius, well, actually, I don't know if all of her poetry genius is in those pages because I don't know that anything can contain all of her poetry genius, but a very large portion of it is right there for you. If you want to get your hands on it, head to mudandinkteaching.org. Let's dive into the episode, shall we? If I have a game plan, they'll go with me. You know, like if I don't have to know what the end of it, like I don't know what our analysis is going to be because I don't want to know what the analysis is going to be. Like something like a sonnet, like I'm always going to know what like the the end of the prologue to Romeo and Juliet. Like I pretty much, I can tell you in one sentence the analysis or like whatever the message behind that is. I don't want to necessarily know, like I want to be able to do that exploration, but I think where it gets intimidating is not having a game plan and something like your tactic, this big six, like strategy to just having a place. It's kind of like our episode from last week, visualizing a unit. Like you got to have somewhere to start to just start chipping away at whatever this big thing is. And so if this poem is the big thing, whatever it is that we're trying to get out of it, some sort of an analysis, some sort of a message statement. Okay, here are some steps to take to begin to form that. And it takes away a lot of the intimidation for not just the kids, but also for the instructor to just be able to say, hey, we've got a new poem. Let's try out our big six on it. Okay, guys, we've done this before. Here we go. I love that that's like you were saying, it's even a bonding moment too, but it's like a community sharing experience in just like digging in, and like they get to hear how each other's brains work and they get to hear how their teacher's brain works and like see it modeled by an adult. Like it's really just like really loving all the things that you're saying today.
Well, I'm really glad. I mean, it's something that I wish one of my English teachers would have done for me before I got to college. Like I didn't really fall in love with poetry until it was the college level. And I feel like it really, for me in high school, was this thing I dreaded because I wanted to get everything right in high school. I wanted to be correct. And that never happened for me in poetry. So it was therefore like not even part of my canon, my own personal canon. I didn't care. That
might be why I'm so comfortable with Shakespeare. It's because there are some like I definitely like to like bust out of the box and like go, yeah, well, this is what's like really widely believed so-and-so is saying in this monologue, but what if it's not, and like break it open. But you have to be able to understand what's widely believed first. Like, I think I liked that decoding piece of Shakespeare's English, but like what you're saying is just being able to like have multiple right answers is so beautiful and scary and awesome, and what we're really going for here. Brave New Teaching, hashtag Brave New Teaching.
Well, it does. It really starts with us. It starts with creating not only a classroom environment where it works, but in ourselves, like embracing these moments to do something a little bit difficult and that are a little bit unconventional. So we got to go for it for our kids and think about what they're going to miss out on if we don't do it. We're in charge.
I don't want you guys, our listeners, to miss out on the last 2 tips that Amanda has for us. So first, we've got to embrace our vulnerability alongside our students. Then we've got teaching poems that we can live in, that are like in our comfort zone. Okay. So whether it's like topic wise, or you can just teach the narrative, whatever that means. And then 3, teach it often, teach it the same way, find a strategy, use Amanda's strategy of the big 6, which she has for us. Check out the show notes, or use a strategy that you are comfortable with as well. Amanda, what's number 4?
So this comes right with what you were saying earlier, is don't feel like you have to reserve like a 3-week chunk of time to teach a poetry unit. It is perfectly wonderful to embed poems into your larger units and thematically connect them to your essential questions, to your texts, and let these poems live alongside the nonfiction. Let them live alongside the fiction that you're reading. And all of a sudden, this kind of intimidating conversation about a poem becomes, well, how does this poem speak to the Scout? Or how does this poem speak to Holden's experience? And now we've got a whole nother way of playing with the poem, because now it's part of either an essential question or it's part of a discussion that we're having about some characters in another book that we're reading. And that makes that experience even more exciting.
Well, and it enriches the conversations. Like if it's something like a novel unit, like you were saying with To Kill a Mockingbird, like it enriches the conversation that you can be having within your classroom. Because I mean, if you're like me and you've taught a certain novel so many times, there really are only so many ways that the conversation is probably going to go. Yeah, every now and then you get that kid that's just got like a left field idea that actually works, and you're like, wow, that's an idea I've never heard before. But like a lot of these high school texts like that are in the canon that we're teaching, you're kind of going down the same path. But if you bring in something like poetry and you can connect that brings in a whole nother, like it opens up the door to richer conversation. So like, I love that. And then I love also not having to have just a poetry unit, because that's where kids start to go, oh, poetry. It's like, no, it's okay. Yes. Yeah. It can just be 1 or 2 within the umbrella of a bigger idea. It's so much more interesting to teach that way too. I think it's more engaging for me, because if I'm not engaged as the teacher, the kids aren't going to be either.
Well, no, and I know you love to do a lot of like paired novels. It's like the same exact concept. When we pair things together and we ask kids to connect the dots, like that's a whole nother critical thinking step that we definitely need to make sure that we're doing as English teachers, as teachers, period, is creating moments for critical thinking that the kids weren't expecting.
Absolutely.
That's so huge.
On those moments of like connection that are a little bit more convoluted, or even just like easy connections for them to make, that then our students feel like they've made a win. Like, oh, wow, something as hard and intimidating as poetry, and I've connected it to my novel, or I've connected it to like another text or life. I'm winning this English game.
Yeah. So here's like a really quick example. So I kind of made a list here of ways that you can embed it. So you don't have to read it, analyze it, discuss it, right? You can have a poem, and I've done a lesson before where I have just started the class by reading it, right? No pretense, no nothing. And I've said, which character wrote this poem?
Oh, that's so cool.
Right? So you can use it as this like creative tool. And then all of a sudden the lesson's actually an argument lesson, and the kids have to write an argument defending which character's voice this sounds more like and why.
And they've had to employ all of these skills that they didn't even, you're so sneaky, all these skills that they didn't even know they were employing, such as they have to understand the words in the message and the voice within the poem, and then connect it, and then use their own understanding and textual evidence to back it up. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, then it's not this dreaded, poetry, I've definitely been there for the moments, and surprising them with poetry is easier to do than with an entire novel, because poetry is manageable. It's class period size.
Yes.
And that's what I love about it. And I teach it. So on the writing side for argument, I've also had kids in my AP language class, which poetry is not really part of that curriculum either. But I would argue that most poems make an argument. They're telling you how the world is according to that speaker, and you can make claims and agree, disagree with a lot of the things that the poem is saying. And I think that that's a really powerful way to approach a quick lesson is, hey, this poet chose to use analogy and rhetorical questions to make this argument about blah, blah, blah. How did that work? How do you like it? Do you agree? Do you disagree? So don't feel like, again, that you have to reserve all this time to do a poetry unit. And then, I mean, you can, and that's awesome. I love doing poetry units, but having kids read, analyze, write, imitate, just go collect language. I mean, that's all part of the blending of the unit that's really fun and not overwhelming.
Yeah, and it just keeps you on your toes too. You get to just like do different stuff. So much more
totally.
fun.
We did for Of Mice and Men, before we read Of Mice and Men, this is another favorite we did, is we looked at a bunch of the Dorothea Lange photos from Library of Congress, Library of Congress, that, big place, that giant library that our nation has.
That one.
Yeah. And she's got all those famous pictures from the Great Depression. And so I kind of had the kids do a silent, I don't know, I think I kept them silent for a solid 5 minutes, which was a victory.
That's just smart.
And they looked at pictures, and I clicked through them on the screen, and the kids were taking notes on imagery. So like they wrote down like, what could they see? What did they imagine? They could have heard, tasted, smelled, right? Throughout all of the pictures, they had a big giant brainstorm list after 5 minutes. And then I taught them what persona poetry was. And I said, in a persona poem, you assume the persona of someone that's not you. And I think I gave them an example, but I might not have. I might have just said that. And then I think I said, I want you guys to try a persona poem and becoming one of the people from a picture that you just saw. So you're going to choose one of these 20 pictures, and I want you guys to write a poem as if you're that person experiencing life through the Great Depression. So it was really cool. The kids freaked out. I don't know how to do it. Oh my God. Blah, blah. It was a total nightmare.
Yep.
And then once everyone calmed down, they wrote awesome stuff, and they pulled from the pictures. They pulled language from each other. They pulled language from their lists, and they all wrote something. And that's just the goal, right? Is to write something. And then the way I have them come back the next day to share is I ask everyone to share their best line, just one line. And then we read them back to back. And it actually kind of creates like a class poem.
That's so
and
cool.
It's stunning. It's stunning to hear it.
What an excellent, I mean, when you bring it back to like pedagogy or I don't even, or just looking at like standards-based curriculum, you are practicing inference. You are practicing word choice. You know what I mean? Like, and it's ways to do this really cool, fun, and creative stuff that sometimes I think we discount because we go, I don't have time for that. That's not going to fit on my standardized exam. Like, there's no way that I can justify that to my admin or like whatever the reason is, which are all valid. I'm not saying like BS your way around them, but there are ways that we are missing huge opportunities for legitimate growth and learning for our students. And it's the things that seem like, well, that's extra. No, I think that actually your students gained a lot of skill with inference with that one day.
Mm-hmm. It was huge. And just the taking chances, I think, especially at the beginning of a unit, it was our first novel together. It also just kind of as a classroom community started to open up the doors for deeper and richer class discussions, which, like you said, are all of those skills are part of discussion and the kind of climate that we want to embrace in a English classroom.
Totally.
Yeah. So that's just 2 examples, but yeah, it's really not that bad. And we will keep sharing ideas. So this brings us to level number 5, which is level 5, because we're going to talk about games. So
we've leveled up.
Leveling up. Yes, we've leveled up to number 5, which is, this one might be the I don't have time for it kind of one. But definitely if you're looking for a reason to have a good time in your classroom, playing games with words, and I'm not even necessarily poetry. This is all about language. So you can definitely use language standards to back these up. But I love playing games with language. I remember when I was a freshman in college, my creative writing professor gave us all these tiny little memo pads, like from the dollar store with the spiral bound top. And they were teeny. And he sent us out on campus and said, come back when half the book is full. And I said, well, what? And we had to fill our notebook with nouns and verbs that were around us and that we could think that came to mind. And I just had to make ginormous, like I learned that listing is every poet you'll ever meet has got a notebook somewhere on their phone or in real life of words, just a list of words, and just learning to love language and then putting it side by side and seeing what happens. So I'm not suggesting that you send your kids off to
Here.
fill a notebook full of words. But I'm also
Underage
not
students,
saying you
please.
shouldn't do that.
Underage students, please take this notebook and go write down everything you see with other underage students.
And then don't get in trouble. I have though sent kids to like during the week. I've said I want you guys to go somewhere during the week with your notepad, and I want you guys to record the things you overhear and like the sights, the sounds, the smells of a particular place. So like and that's really cool. And then the kids can create a poem out of that. Another game that I like to play, I've done with teaching kids what an ode is, but this works for all different kinds of poems, is that I bring in paper bags and I fill them with things that the kids can touch, smell, taste, and describe texture. So they kind of fill out a chart and they look at a dried apricot and they give me, right, like this thing looks like a blank, 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 blank. And the group works together to make a nice long list. And then it smells like a blank, 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 blank. And then they kind of, they rotate the paper bags of surprise ingredients and random objects around the room. It's great. And it's really, it seems like this superfluous waste of time kind of lesson. But when you watch kids try to describe what does a dried apricot look like, I mean,
with appropriate language.
Well, right. But they're totally accessing that language standard and trying to find the best words. And then they're saying, no, that's inappropriate. Or, no, it's not like that. It's like this. And they're looking at nuance. And I don't think a lot of other disciplines out there, sorry, math teachers, but we deal with nuance. And a lot of times we gloss over it because we're so worried about quizzing you on that plot element from last night's reading.
Well, the big picture stuff and like teaching writing is one of the, like, it's our white whale, right? Like it is hard. And when there isn't time to do it justice, like basically the structure of writing is really where I think a lot of us, and I might just be speaking for myself, run out of time. Like, okay, did you get that structure of the argument down? Great. And what we lose is word choice and style and just their voice coming through, and something as simple as taking the time to, what does that take you? Like 30 minutes? Like how long would that game? Maybe 30 minutes, have like an extended bell ringer and that's it. And then you get into your argumentative writing. Well, now you can challenge students because they've opened up that piece of their brain to use more words, like list 5 words that could be saying the word you're trying to say right there. And then you've got a better lead in for a quote, like it sounds superfluous, but it is not. It is so, it just enriches everything that you do. And it's hard to get back to that kind of stuff when you feel like things have to get cut away and cut away and cut away. But it's also just so much more fun.
It is fun. And the kids, you can feel it when the kids need a break. So kind of having a little arsenal of go-tos.
Sure.
That, like I said, don't have to take a whole class period. That's definitely something to keep in the back. 2 other ones I'll share with you guys before we kind of wrap up here. Another great activity I've used before is called the N+7. And this is not an original creation of mine. This is actually out of the Olympian poets. They're a movement of poetry from kind of around like the surrealist times, like the 20s. And, these guys were like, poetry doesn't have to be literal. It should be like how we feel it. And, which is, I think a lot of that's coming back again in the 2020s. So N+7 requires the use of something you might not have in your classroom. It requires a dictionary. Anyone?
I'm sorry, what?
Have a dictionary in their classroom?
I can ask Alexa.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I just set off Alexa behind me. That's funny.
Okay, so to play N+7, you get a physical dictionary. You're going to circle then all of the nouns in the poem, either that you've written or you're studying as a class. So skip all the pronouns, skip all the proper nouns, but circle all the other ones. And then in the dictionary, look up the noun, then look for the noun that's 7 nouns later and replace the original word with the one that's 7 words later to rewrite the poem.
Oh my gosh, that's so fun.
It's so fun and it's so crazy. But then when the kids reread the new piece, they kind of go, wow, because what happens, right? If you guys play with language enough, nouns are what create metaphor. And so when you replace the nouns, you're basically creating metaphor. And some of them will not work. Like they'll be really dumb.
Like,
and then
cheeseburger unicorn. And you're like, yeah, it doesn't work.
But I can see a cheeseburger unicorn.
My daughter, my 3-year-old would be all in.
Right. I mean, so it's really cool. And then you tell the kids like, okay, now you have this new piece. Play with it. Keep what you like, delete what you don't, and now mess around and you've got this new thing to work with, this new creation. And so that's a really fun way to have kids work with language. And then the final one I would offer to you guys is what I call cut and paste poetry, is to take a poem, cut it up line by line, cut it up stanza by stanza, however you want, rearrange it, and then talk about the differences, right? How does this poem change if we move this place here or move this thing here? What is the effect of the organization? That just offers up another way for you guys to just talk about theme, message, turns, shifts, the speaker. Why was it originally the way it was? Is it better the way that you made it? And again, they can do that with someone else's piece or with their own and have a discussion at the end about the changes and present them and all that good stuff.
That's really cool. And it takes away a lot of the intimidation on like language. That is so cool. Amanda, thank you so much for taking the time and just like really thinking through these 5 big ways to boost your confidence as a teacher teaching poetry. I know I appreciate it, and I feel like I can very confidently speak for our friends who are out there in the world listening that they appreciate it as well. Like I can already tell you, I've been taking notes as we've been talking about things that I can bring into my classroom like tomorrow. So that's just really cool. And before we close out completely, we are going to ask you all for your questions, your comments, your concerns, any sorts of things that you can add to this conversation. Either leave them here in the comment section down below. If you are listening through our blog, you could do that there, or catch up with us on social media. All of our tags are linked in our show notes. And yeah, we can't wait to like keep this conversation going, especially if you have like poem suggestions. I feel like now that we've like got the ball rolling here, some suggestions of actual text are going to be really, really good and just an awesome way to like keep it all going. And then Amanda, I do have one more question for you. And it's how we close out every episode.
Do you really?
I really do.
Yes, it is. I'm ready for it.
Are you? What are you obsessed with right now?
I am totally obsessed with my buddy Kendra, her podcast, The Lazy Genius. I have to talk about Kendra. She is actually a genius, and she says she's a lazy genius, but I think she's actually just a genius, period. If you guys have never... no, not at all. If you guys have never checked out the Lazy Genius podcast, you should. She is a lifestyle blogger and podcaster, and she talks a lot about the ways that you can manage your life and basically choose between what really matters to you and what doesn't. And her tagline is, be a genius about the things that matter and lazy about the things that don't. So she's got everything from freezer meal hacks to routines, which I love routine stuff. Oh my God. I love the idea of a morning routine, and I love thinking about it more than actually having one. So she's got all kinds of good things like that. Lazy Genius podcast. I'll link her below, and definitely go check her out. Miss Marie, yes. What are you obsessed with right now?
You know what I'm obsessed with is I'm obsessed with going back to the books that I read as a kid and reading them aloud to my own kids. And I know it's very like, oh, but like, I'm just loving sharing those stories. Like right now, my kids and I are probably 2/3 of the way through Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And it's a story that like has a special place in my heart for a lot of different reasons. But it's like, I'm finding the funny things that my, 6 and 3-year-old respectively are finding interesting. And it's stuff that I didn't even notice. And so there's just something like breathing new life into older stories. And it's like become a part of our nightly routine. Speaking of routines, we read a chapter, and like, it sounds daunting, but like, it's really not that bad. Like, it's pretty short little chapters. And so I'm obsessed with that little time that we're having together. It's really cool.
Oh, that's so sweet. You guys, Marie is so cute. Why don't you guys go to give us the review, because Marie is the best and she tells us the cutest things to be obsessed with.
And Amanda just taught us how to teach poetry. So like, teaching credential be gone. We've now learned how to do it all. So leave that in your iTunes review. Huh, guys? Thanks.
Thank you for attending the University of Amanda. I was happy to have you.
You know what? Are you expecting like tuition out of this, or we should probably have that conversation later?
Another day. But no, I'm happy. I think it would be a reward enough to have more teachers teaching poetry.
Totally.
I think it would make it a lot less terrifying if we all just kind of were happy about it together rather than begrudging.
I like it. No one wants to be begrudging because that does not do anything good for students. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. We are excited to have you here, and we cannot wait to talk to you again. Have a good one.
See you next Thursday.